Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Apollo 12's Tomorrowland. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 30 to 45-minute presentation and then he'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. And feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Nick Partridge is a writer and spokesperson for the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where he hosts the podcast Airspace, now in its 5th season. And we're so happy to have him here tonight. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm going to work from notes, so please don't judge me. I've seen George Carlin do it, not in person, but it can be done, and I hope it can be done elegantly. It has been a busy week for me, and today is a Wednesday that feels kind of like a Monday in a good way, if you believe me, and a lot like a Friday in a good way, even though it's not. But I am really, really glad that it is Wednesday because I get to hang out with all of you and talk about one of my favorite missions. So, Apollo 12. What can be said? It was the second human landing on the moon. Spoiler, they make it. And it's one that I really like to talk about because it's not that famous. The crew is going to have to forgive me for saying that. I'm friends with some of their families. And I think there's special joy in history that you get to discover. Anyone who lived through the Apollo era certainly remembers Apollo 11. Anyone who grew up after the Apollo era, like I did, had pictures of Buzz Aldrin on the walls of their classrooms. Like, you always kind of knew about Apollo 11, but 12 has so much joy, and it's just such a pleasure to read about it for the first time. I will say that my very favorite mission is Apollo 8. Apollo 8 had a lot of majesty and drama, and it was Christmas. Like, they literally reached the moon on Christmas Eve. So if everything goes really well here tonight, maybe Deborah will have me back at Christmas. So maybe in December, we'll do Apollo 8. But 12, I'm going to be working a little bit from a text tonight, and I wanted to cite my sources. One thing, I'm not a historian. I am a writer, host, spokesperson. I get to editorialize it a little bit, and I'm glad I'm not a historian because I have a lot more fun telling stories when I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm over dramatizing them. And that brings me to the source for tonight's presentation. And one of the things that we touched on was how this mission was portrayed in popular media. This is a book called A Man on the Moon by Andrew Chaiken. Andrew was a geologist, not a historian, at the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, which is a scientific unit within the National Air and Space Museum. He and I missed each other by about 15 years. I bought this book in my hometown in Athens, Georgia, before I ever thought about moving to Washington, D.C. I read it cover to cover because, to me, the space program is optimism. It is the best of what we can do. And I read this at a time when that's what I was really looking for, and I happened to absorb a ton of history, and I fully credit Andrew Chaiken with me talking my way into the National Air and Space Museum. I was an intern, I had a lot of background, I had a lot of passion. This book, the literal one that I bought in Athens, Georgia, anyone who worked at Borders can read that code, is the reason that I do what I do now. And one of the most special Smithsonian moments that I ever had was researching a speech that I was writing, not being able to find a quote, and then realizing I could probably email Andrew Chaiken. We know some of the same people. He wrote right back. It was amazing. So this was also the basis for a TV series. I am a big fan of this. So is Tom Hanks. We know about Apollo 13. Tom Hanks starred in it. Ron Howard directed it. Tom Hanks produced and hosted a dramatic television series on HBO based on the Apollo missions. And roughly each mission got its own episode, and there's one about 12, and it follows this text very well. So 2 things that I highly recommend for the overall Apollo program. Andy's extremely accessible, comprehensive history of the entire program, and Tom Hanks's excellent interpretation of it. It's on HBO Max. It's called From the Earth to the Moon. I was going to hold up my DVDs, could not find them. So, the story of Apollo 12 begins probably the night of Apollo 11, when they set down on the moon and Neil and Buzz walked early. They were actually supposed to sleep for 6 hours, but everybody watches it and everybody's celebrating. And champagne corks are popping in Houston. And one of the other astronauts of the program raises a glass and says, "Here's to the Apollo program. It's all over." And you got to think, this was somebody that wanted to fly to the moon and walk on the moon. And he's toasting the end of the Apollo program after the first landing. And that was kind of a reflection of a very real sentiment at the time, even among the space community, that Kennedy had challenged us to go to the moon and land a human safely and return them to Earth. That was it. Never said anything about picking up rocks. And there was an idea, particularly in the White House, the Nixon White House at this point, that you don't ask Charles Lindbergh to fly the Atlantic twice. You've demonstrated it. What more is there to do? Now, some heads within NASA had interpreted Kennedy's challenge as saying, and this is in his text, Kennedy did roughly say this, that we should be a spacefaring nation, that we should voyage wherever humans can go and stake the American ideals in the fields of exploration, science, fields of technology. I think the line from the speech that I'm remembering is something akin to where any human goes, free men must also share, or free men must lead. So there was a real call for exploring the moon, but it wasn't a sure thing by any stretch of the imagination. So that was the context of Apollo 12 launching. And there is a little bit of hair raised in Apollo 12 in the mission. And I'll start with that, and then we're going to get to a lot of fun. So spoiler, lay it out, table of contents. I'm going to try to share my screen. Anyone watching at home, please forgive my transitions. This is perhaps going to be inelegant, but know that we're all having a good time. So let me see here. Okay, can everyone see this? So there's a little bit of irony here, because the line that I want to lead with is, "It was a dark and stormy day." And you can see here that it's not dark and stormy. This is the Apollo 12 Saturn V on the launch pad, but clearly a few days before the launch. The launch of Apollo 12 was in the morning, and it was just pelting rain. And they had Air Force planes circling, weather reconnaissance, whole 9 yards. And it would clear for a little bit, and then it would cloud over again. But there was no lightning in the area, 19 miles in any direction, no lightning in the area. We're good to go. That's a touch of something called go fever, which is something within NASA. And we could unpack more of that later. Sometimes it's not such a good thing. But in this case, this was the first all-Navy crew. Everybody in this crew was in the Navy. So they weren't going to let a little bit of rain stop them. And so they're sitting, waiting for launch. Countdown's going. And they are atop this behemoth. I chose this picture because it's a really good illustration of the Saturn V. The Saturn V was, by some accounts, the most complex, most powerful machine ever built. By some estimates, the explosive power in all of its fuel roughly equaled an atomic bomb, and they are sitting on top of it. The whole stack is about 363 feet tall and about 60 feet more if you add on the launch platform. Now, for scale, here is a Saturn V on the Washington Monument. For the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, and we're not talking about that mission, we projected a full-size, to-the-inch Saturn V rocket onto the Washington Monument, which is the tallest thing in Washington, D.C., and this is what it looked like, to give you an idea of the scope. That was a really fun program. I got to work on the team that did it. It was the reason all of my hair went gray, but it was a wonderful experience. There's a whole 17-minute show recreating the entire mission. I encourage you to go seek it out if this evening's festivities whet your appetite. I too had to deal with no lightning in 19-mile radius. We are good to go. But the Saturn V was just magnificent. And we get down to go time. 3, 2, 1, launch. This is what a Saturn V looks like as it launches. This was the Apollo 12 launch. As you can see, the sky is dark. And everything was fine. Everything was great. Apollo 12 was going to be a nominal mission. It was going to be perfect. Maybe not as exciting as 11, but they were going to go to the moon. They were going to go in style. And the launch of a Saturn V, man, oh man, those crowds were packed to see the launch in Florida that day, rain notwithstanding. Lots of umbrellas, lots of ponchos got sold that day. Richard Nixon was there. He was the first president to witness a rocket launch from Cape Canaveral. Everything was going swimmingly. This skyscraper turned over at exactly the right moment, headed towards the moon. And then 32 seconds after liftoff, there was a flash. Nobody knows what it is. Pete Conrad, if you'll pardon me, and I'll characterize this a bit more later, Pete Conrad shouts into the headset, "The hell was that?" He was the commander of the mission. He had seen the flash out of the corner of his eye. And then the whole world went dark. All of his systems shut down, and all of his warning lights lit up. Now, we've all driven cars that may have been less reliable, and if all the dashboard lights come on at once, that's a big problem. About 52 seconds after that, the 8-ball started spinning. The 8-ball is the attitude indicator, tells you that the ship is still level. Now, he knew he wasn't spinning, but that meant that the navigation platform had disappeared. So at 52 seconds, the navigation platform falls out. He says, "Gang, we just lost the platform." Houston is really sweating it. They're trying to figure out what is going on. Houston is in charge now. The launch control, that's what this is, hands it over when they clear the tower. So the astronauts don't know what's going on. They're reading off system error after system error after system error after system error. And Houston has thousands of people trying to work this problem. And the interesting thing to know about the Apollo system is there's the astronauts in the ship. There's the Capcom, capsule communicator. He's the only one that speaks to the astronauts. And he is always an astronaut because nobody can speak an astronaut's language better than an astronaut. So the person on the radio with the astronauts is always an astronaut. There's the flight controller, flight director. If you've ever seen Apollo 13, it was Ed Harris, white vest. But then there are dozens of people at these consoles, and each one of them has dozens of people backing them up, watching all of this unfold. And the spacecraft is dark. The flight director, this was his first mission, and he's thinking, I'm going to have to abort the mission. The crew can eject. It is unspeakably dangerous. And he calls out to his electronics engineer, whose name is Econ. He's 24 years old. And he says, "Do you know what's going on? What do I do?" And Econ looks at his screen, which is just gibberish. And in the years of simulation, he remembered one thing like this. And he says, "Try SCE to aux." Flight controller says, "What?" "Try SCE to aux." Now, the flight controllers have faith in their people. He says, "Do it." Capcom doesn't know what that switch is. Flight controller doesn't know what that switch is, but they radio it up. Pete Conrad says, "NCE to aux? What on earth is that?" Here's what the switch looked like. It's the one on the left in the middle that's flipped down towards aux. Power, SCE, PMP, norm. So flip the switch from norm to aux. Now, to give you an idea of the challenge of trying to do this in a spacecraft that is quickly losing control and power, this is the Apollo command panel. And SCE to aux is all the way in the little corner here with the red arrow on the right. That is a pretty obscure switch in a panel and spacecraft that has thousands of them. And Pete Conrad's the commander, a steely-eyed missile man if ever there was one. Dick Gordon, his right-hand man, who was literally sitting on his right-hand side, also didn't know what it was. They're baffled. Suddenly a voice calls out, "I know what that is." And Al Bean, who is in the far right-hand seat, reaches over and flips it. And just then, everything comes back. They got it all back. And I want to take a second. I wrote in the description that every trip to the moon begins in Waltham. And here's what I mean by that. And here's why it saved Apollo 12. The Apollo guidance computer was the brain that piloted this ship. 336 feet tall, generating as much power as dozens of Hoover dams every second. And the brain was about the size of a bread box. It was a sealed metal box. And this is at a time when computers were the size of houses. So the Apollo guidance computer was very special and very advanced. The whole software was about 2 megs, which is less than the size of the photo that we're looking at now. And the extraordinary thing, because they didn't have hard drives, not as the way we now understand them, was that all of the software was encoded on something called rope memory, which is thousands and thousands of little iron ferrite donuts, little round discs. And you would thread a copper wire through it or over it, and that would indicate a 1 or a 0. And we all know the ones and zeros, there's hundreds of thousands of them, and even a simple program. And you thread all of these little guys together with the wires going exactly where they needed to. Then you put a fabric cover over them, and that's rope core memory. And rope core memory was developed by MIT and Raytheon, and every single one of the Apollo missions carried a computer that was woven by hand, digit by digit, by a group of women, mostly, in Waltham at the Raytheon factory. And they were called at the time little old ladies, which is slightly diminutive. I will admit. I'm going to duck out of frame for 1 second. Something I forgot to do was plug in my computer, and now we're good. The little old ladies, it's a diminutive nickname, but they had so much respect within NASA. NASA paid them triple overtime whenever there was nothing for them to do to keep them from leaving for other projects because they were so critical to the success of the space race. The astronauts visited them frequently so that the women could see the people that were going to carry their handwork to the moon and back, and so that the astronauts could meet the people that literally held their lives in their hands. Now, one of the extraordinary things about rope core memory, can you imagine your computer getting struck by lightning? Not a good thing, not a good thing, particularly when you're riding atop an atomic bomb. Rope core memory, as we were discussing, is physically encoded. It can't be changed very easily, even if it's struck by lightning. So when the ECOM, when the electronics engineer, made the call SCE to aux, it reset the platform, and the rope core memory had held all of the data. So when they reconnected the fuel cells on their way up, everything went back to normal. They got struck by lightning, and everything came back. They salvaged the whole platform. To give you an idea of what kind of, I said, steely-eyed missile man Pete Conrad was, nobody knew what had happened. They didn't retrieve this film until months later, maybe days. But As he's riding up to orbit, he's still in the Earth's atmosphere, and he says, "Gang, I'm not sure we didn't get struck by lightning." And here, to kind of drive a little bit of drama into the story that we're discussing, is the Saturn V fully encompassed in a bolt of lightning. Now, lightning never strikes twice, but I told you it did strike twice. I'm having a little trouble with that other picture. So here's what happened. When you launch a rocket, there's a trail of flame hundreds of feet long and ionized gas beyond that. And the atmosphere was charged by the storm that was ensuing. And it's maybe less accurate to say Apollo 12 was struck by lightning and more accurate to say that Apollo 12 struck lightning twice at 32 seconds and 52 seconds. They created a spark, they created a lightning rod, then they flew directly through a storm cloud. And that was unprecedented in history, and they were lucky to live to tell the tale. Now, that's the most hair-raising part. We're okay for now. They're on their way up to orbit. It's an all-sailor crew, and they're all test pilots, and they're good ones at that. By the time they reach orbit, they have turned this into a sea story. They're laughing about it. They're joking and saying, "Oh my God, do you remember those lights lighting up?" And Pete's saying, like, I close my eyes and all I can see is those lights. Like, I bet our wives just completely like, oh my God, wouldn't have wanted. Wow, what a way to start this trip. And then they get up to orbit and they start checking everything out. So they're going to check out all their systems, and I'm going to take a step back and contextualize a little bit more of Apollo 12. It's the middle child of the Apollo program. There are lesser known missions, certainly, but we've said that this one comes after Apollo 11, a few months, and it's just before Apollo 13. So everybody remembers 11, everybody remembers 13. 12 is right in the middle. And it's in some respects the Jan Brady of Apollo missions. You've got the really dramatic one that did it first. You've got the really dramatic one that was in a lot of danger. Then you've got Apollo 12 that gets their heart pumping moment at the very beginning. And then it's reliable, it's funny, it gets the job done. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The reason that Apollo 12 was important to the overall program was that, and they don't talk about this very often, it's not a shameful secret or anything, Apollo 11 landed 4 miles off. The only mission for Apollo 11 was land safely. But if we were going to continue exploring the moon, we needed to land exactly where we said we were going to land. I said that NASA had big ideas. They wanted the space program to continue. This is part of the reason that I called tonight Tomorrowland. And NASA had a plan for a 12-person space station by the end of the 60s or the beginning of the 70s. They had a plan for a 50-person station not long after that. They had a plan for a Mars landing, a human Mars landing in the middle of the 80s. They had all these plans. If you remember 2001: A Space Odyssey, there's this big donut space station, hundreds of people living on it. That was an actual concept. Kubrick borrowed that from some of the brains that actually thought up and developed Apollo, and that's where they really thought they might be headed. And if their funding had kept up, we would have had some version of that. So Apollo 12 was still kind of living in Tomorrowland. You know, we had had the high water mark of 11, and 12 was going to prove, hopefully, that we could hit the mark on the moon and therefore explore the moon effectively and earn the paycheck for the program to continue. Space stations, more lunar landers, lunar base, Mars landings. So that was the mission, a pinpoint landing. And the way that they were going to prove the pinpoint landing was that they said they were going to set it down not just on the Sea of Tranquility, not just on, and this is one of the great names in space exploration, the Ocean of Storms. That's where Apollo 12 was headed. They were going to set it down directly next to Surveyor 3. Surveyor 3 was a unmanned, we don't say that anymore, uncrewed. It was a robot. Surveyor 3 was a robot. Didn't rove. It was just a probe. And it set down on the moon, soft landing, fully intact, a few years before Neil Armstrong flew. It studied the surface. It gathered data that we needed to understand how to land. So they said, we are going to set down in sight of Surveyor 3. And not only that, we're going to walk up to it. We're gonna cut a piece off of it and bring it home so we can see what being on the moon for a 3 years does to our technology. That's a laudable thing. That's going to move us really far ahead. Now the trick, and this is one of the differences between the American and Soviet space program, is we were going to do it live, and we told them that's what we were going to do. The Soviets had a different system. Sometimes they sent up the missions, got them back safely, then they announced. We called the ball. We said we were going to do this thing, and if we didn't do it, it was going to be known immediately on live color television. So that was the purpose of Apollo 12. Now, lightning strike notwithstanding, the real joy of Apollo 12 was the crew. They were each characters, but more than that, they were best friends. Astronauts are competitive by nature. Astronauts are often a lot alike, and Neil Armstrong is remote like Abraham Lincoln. Buzz Aldrin is larger than even the life that he lives. If you've ever seen the rings that man wears. But they weren't friends. They were respectful colleagues. They jockeyed with each other for position. They kept in touch after the mission. But Pete Conrad, the commander, Dick Gordon, the lunar module pilot, and Al Bean were buddies. They were best friends. And I'm going to show you a few pictures of them now, if I can get my pictures to behave. So let me... Okay, let's see if anyone's going to... All right, I am off kilter for some reason. Yeah, this is good enough. So this is the crew. This is the crew standing in front of their Saturn V. No Washington Monument for scale. This is Dick Gordon. I'm sorry, this is Pete Conrad. This is Dick Gordon, and this is Al Bean. Now, one thing that you may notice if you have spent a lot of time looking at crew photos is they are all smiling. They're smiling in that one too. Here they are again. I gotta say, I have had the privilege of meeting some of the Apollo astronauts. They are heroes of mine, and they are some of the greatest human beings you could possibly imagine. Very rarely are they together, smiling like this, standing inside of a complex machine that was built by the lowest bidder. All Navy crew, go Navy, plastered across the front of Pete's spacesuit. Trademark of his is silly hats. I don't have any other photos of it, but they are out there. Google Pete Conrad hats. Here they are hanging out. Gotta say, Neil, Buzz, and Michael Collins, first director of our museum, Lunar Module, Command Module Pilot on Apollo 11, they didn't hang out. They didn't hang out. NASA brass said, these guys didn't socialize together. This is 12. This is different. You see also that they're reclining on a gold Corvette. They had matching cars. Pete Conrad negotiated a deal when they all got on the mission together, and they bought matching gold Corvettes, and they were detailed on the side with their mission role: commander, lunar module pilot, command module pilot, C, M, P, and they would just tool around in these guys. And this is kind of like, this is the kind of camaraderie that you didn't get anywhere else in the program. Slight detour. This is Al Bean's Corvette on the National Mall. The Washington Monument is there for scale, but you know, it's a little deceptive. The Corvette isn't giant. This is actually in front of our museum a few years ago, and you can't really see it, but this is where it says LMP for Lunar Module Pilot. So let's talk about the individual members of the crew. This is Pete Conrad. Pete Conrad is cool. That's why I picked this photo. It's from a little bit after the mission. He was in an ad for Revo sunglasses. And I think this sums him up so well. He was cool under pressure, but he was also funny. He hummed while he worked. He smacked his gum. It drove the flight controllers crazy because they could hear it in their headphones. He swore like the sailor that he was, and he just cracked jokes all of the time. But he was among the best aviators in the world at the time and among the best astronauts. And you can tell because he was almost the first person to land on the moon. There was a switcheroo earlier in the program, but for a minute, this was going to be him. And the PR folks at NASA, were kind of worried about this wise-cracking, humming, gap-toothed little guy. He was 5'6", with red hair, but not much of it left, who, if he tripped, might cuss. Like, he was just the best. His wife, Nancy, and I have talked a lot, and she said, Pete was the guy that you wanted at the dinner party. He set the tone for the party and he set the tone for the mission, and that's how it worked. This is Dick Gordon. He was an equal to Pete in terms of aviation. He was kind of had a boxer-ness about him, like big jaw. He wanted to be a priest early on, but got drafted in the Korean War, took a test flight, loved it. He met Pete Conrad years before NASA at test pilot school, and they became fast friends. And then they served together, and they flew on and off of their aircraft carrier together, and they had nights in the bars at San Diego, and these two just became inseparable. And then they entered to become astronauts. They entered the selection process. Pete made it, Dick didn't. And there's a framed photo that hung on Dick's office wall, and it was Pete Conrad standing in front of his airplane, and it said, to Dickie. Nancy tells me that they called him Dickie. And it said, until we serve again. And of course, Dick was selected the next time. So now they're both astronauts. And they flew in space together, and they had a grand adventure. There is nothing that forges a relationship like flying in space. They had so much fun that one of the stories goes that there was an EVA. Dick Gordon needed to stand up with his head entirely out of the hatch, like waist out of the door of the Gemini spacecraft. And he fell asleep. And Pete Conrad also fell asleep. They were just asleep with their door open to the void of space, flying 17,000 miles an hour. And one of them woke up, said, oh my God, would you believe I fell asleep? The other one said, huh, what? And that's when they realized that they were both just snoozing, whizzing around the earth. So they get back, they're as inseparable as they ever were. This is Al Bean. Al Bean was a great aviator. He wasn't really a self-promoter. He wasn't cocky. He was quiet. When the other astronauts were out racing before he got his gold Corvette, he took painting classes. He was one of the only astronauts with brown eyes. That's something. Don't really know what, but the other astronauts with brown eyes kind of shared the similar soul. They were poets, they were writers. And Al Bean, this is the other part about Tomorrowland, was nowhere near a mission. He was stuck in a place called the Apollo Applications Project. That was figuring out what to do with Apollo after Apollo. And Pete Conrad knew Al from test pilot school, loved him. And when NASA said, who do you want with you as the third seat on Apollo 12? He said, I want Al. They said, no, he's in Apollo Applications. And Pete said, okay, he's stuck in Tomorrowland. That's what he called it, because it was thinking through all of the future stuff. And there was kind of an Epcot-ness about it. There was like a fantasy-ness about it, even though they were talking about it. But he was sitting in conference rooms looking at binders for projects that may never happen. He spent the longest time as a rookie out of all of the astronauts of his class. Now, here's one note of tragedy in this story. Pete said, okay, I can't have Al. I'll take C.C. Williams. C.C. Williams was another great astronaut. And when they were in training, C.C. Williams was flying a jet home to see his father and crashed. and he was killed. I believe it was in the Florida Everglades. He's on the astronaut wall of honor. He was an American hero. But now they need a new lunar module pilot. And Pete, brash as ever, says, I still want Al. So NASA says, okay. And Pete Gordon, his instructor from years ago and seemingly a million miles away, a real astronaut, walks into Tomorrowland one day and he says, Al, I just wanted to ask, do you want to go to the moon with Dick and me? Story goes, Al didn't know what to say. He was speechless. He just kind of nodded, kind of whimpered, and says, okay, clapped him on the shoulder, and away we go. So they get up to orbit, and here's a short thing, and then I'll tell you about this picture. They get up to orbit. When Apollo 8 reached orbit, Frank Borman, who was a crew cut, he was a human crew cut, he scolded the other astronauts. He says, I do not want to see you looking out the window. He says this to the rookie, never been in space. We got a lot of work to do. I do not want to see you looking out the window. When they get to orbit, even though they're checking out the spacecraft, Pete and Dick have been around this world before. They start giving Al a tour. They say, come over to the window. Look, these are city lights. This is the Atlantic Ocean. They get over Africa. And Al says, are those campfires? Can I see campfires? He said, yeah, that's what those are. Those are people gathered around campfires. And you just rode a column of fire 500 feet long into the sky and you're going to the moon. And when they were given the go for TLI, which is called translunar injection, you are go for the moon. Al Bean, time of his life, can't believe he's going to the moon with his best friends. This is going to be the greatest adventure of his life. Pete Conrad says, Al Bean, you are going to the moon. Al had a great Texas accent. He replies, yeah, y'all can come along if you like. In the HBO series, to give you an idea of the levity of this mission, Al Bean is played by Dave Foley from Kids in the Hall and News Radio. It's just a joy. Now, one thing about the way the Apollo system worked, the lunar module only held 2 people. So there's Pete, the senior astronaut and commander. There's Al, the rookie, and Dick Gordon stays in the ship. He stays in the ship orbiting the moon. He doesn't go down. The role of command module pilot was considered senior because he was alone, so he couldn't land on the moon with them. But testament to the fact that they were all friends, he never said that he was disappointed. But there comes a time when he's got to shut the hatch on his 2 friends who are going down for this amazing adventure, and he's just going to stay in the ship, intended. And that was one sad note, was when the best friends parted. And that begins like the next part of the adventure. We're actually flying down to the moon. Oh, hey, I left one thing out. I'm sorry. This mission had a soundtrack. Pete insisted that they be allowed to bring music along. The other missions had music. Neil Armstrong chose, I'm not kidding, theremin music. Theremin music. Woo! It's the Halloween sound. Otherworldly guy, didn't belong to us. Pete selected country music. Al's thing was top 40. They danced their way to the moon to Sugar Sugar. They just like, and they're dancing in 0G. Nobody's ever done this before. Sugar Sugar. This is the way they got to the moon. So Pete and Al get in the ship. They're headed down to the moon. Dick tending the home ship. These are out of order. So the pinpoint landing, they were navigating by something called Snowman Crater, a little more humor and levity. And they get down to the moon and they land. Still trying to figure out where they are. They think they're in roughly the right neighborhood, and we'll get to that in a second. Actually, no, you know, they hit it. So here in the background, that's the LEM. This is Surveyor 3. And this is Al Bean. And this is the camera that they cut off. I'm doing this a little bit out of order. You'll have to forgive me. We all know how it ends, happily. They cut this camera off. It wasn't easy. I've seen it. It's in the National Air and Space Museum. It's bigger than it looks. And this was the trophy that they brought back, put it on display in the Smithsonian. So they land, they've done it. They hit the pin. They got to within walking distance. They got the pictures. It's wonderful. Pete Conrad, funny guy. NASA was nervous about him being the Apollo 11 commander because nobody knew what he would say. But then some people thought that NASA PR told them what to say when they landed on the moon. It's not true, Pete Conrad says. And a reporter friend of his, an Italian woman that was covering the Apollo missions, they were reclining by a pool before the mission. And she said, no, somebody wrote that for Neil. And he goes, I don't know if somebody wrote it, but that was what Neil wanted to say. NASA didn't tell him what to say. She goes, no, you can't prove it. And he goes, I can. I will tell you what I'm going to say right now, right here. And I will bet you $500 that I say it. She hears what he plans to say and she says, absolutely no way. You're not going to do it. You can't do it. They'll never let you. So Pete Conrad lands on the moon, gets out. He's going to be the third human being to step on the largest natural satellite in the solar system, our moon. And he gets down and he goes, whoopee! That may have been one small step for Neil, but that was a big one for a little guy like me. Remember, he's 5'6", one of the shortest astronauts. They were all under 6 feet. I met John Glenn, by the way, once, and I knew he was under 6 feet because he had to be, which is weird because he seemed 25 feet tall to me, but maybe that was just him. So they're on the moon. They've made it. Whoopee. They hit their pinpoint landing. Al's job was to deploy a color television camera. And this is kind of where the forgiving nature of a fun mission comes in. He's supposed to deploy a color television camera, and he accidentally shined it at the sun, completely blanked it out. So the world's not even watching them. They're just having the time of their lives. They're audio only. And what they hear is, Pete Conrad humming, driving everybody nuts. Nobody can even see them up on the moon. They tried hitting the camera with a hammer. Didn't work. Worked a little, but then they hit it again. It stopped entirely. Let's see. Let me check my notes. One thing that they were going to do to demonstrate how great friends they were, and I'm running close to time, but forgive me, I'm getting there. Al Bean had snuck a timer for a camera. They had Hasselblad cameras, and he had snuck a timer into one of the stowage bags. Snuck is a strong word, but it's a small piece of them. And they had a plan. There are no photos of Neil Armstrong on the moon. You can see him reflected in Buzz's visor. That's Buzz in the famous photo. But there are no pictures of them together because they had to take a picture of one another. 12 brought a timer, and they were gonna stick it on the camera, and then they were gonna run over to Surveyor Crater, take a picture together, and then not tell anyone. And it was going to be this great joke on NASA because they were going to develop the film. And that's the first time that NASA was going to find out that they had a picture of two astronauts. It was going to be a great gag. Al couldn't find it. Like, time on the moon is really precious. Cost about $1 million a minute to keep them up there. And that's in 1960s dollars. Now, by the way, like a major motion picture is about $1 million a minute. Digress. They never found the timer. In time. They did find the timer, but it was too late. And they just chucked it through zero gravity. Still up there today. They get back up off the moon. They launch, same as Apollo 11 did. Apollo 11 planted their flag too close to their ship, knocked it over in the jet wash. 12 didn't, so that flag's still standing, probably bleached out by now. They get up there and they're going around the backside of the moon. And it reminds me a lot of when Pete gave Al a tour of the Earth from orbit. He said, hey, we're around the dark side of the moon. Far side of the moon. I get scolded for calling it dark. Do you want to fly? The lunar module pilot never flies. He's there kind of as a backup and to walk. Yeah, he actually gets to do the thing that he's trained for. Because his best friend and mentor said, we're on the other side of the moon. Literally no one can see us. And what are they going to do? Make us come back home? So Al got to fly the ship. They dock back with Dick in the command module. They come in. They're filthy with moon dust, by the way. Dick makes them take off their spacesuits. So to put it diplomatically, they headed back for Earth, two of them in their birthday suits. The joke went, if anything happens in hundreds of years when they reach us in orbit, they're going to see some hilarity. They're on their way back. They make it back. It's all great. And they splash down, and told you about the color TV camera, told you about the camera timer. Al Bean just does not have a lot of luck with cameras on this mission. Camera falls straight off of a shelf when they hit the ocean, bonks him on the head. He goes unconscious for a few minutes. So he's got a little Band-Aid in all of the post-mission photos, but he made it. They all made it. Let me see if I can get better control of the photos, because I still want to show you guys a couple of those. Please ignore my messy desktop. Here we are. They're back home. This is the Apollo quarantine trailer. Up through 12, we weren't sure there weren't moon germs, so they quarantined them. So here they are, all smiles, like we knew them at the beginning of the trip, looking out the back window of a, no joke, Airstream trailer, modified Airstream trailer. We've got one on display in the museum from 11. And they're just having the time of their lives. They're back at camp. They've just had the most amazing, incredible adventure. And now they spend 2 weeks just bunking together to talk it all up and laugh at every part of it. There was a phone call. Oh, by the way, you can see Al's Band-Aid. President Nixon called them to congratulate them and promoted them all to captain. And so there's a scene in From the Earth to the Moon, and they're all wearing funny hats. Pete was a funny hat guy. And they're like, yes, sir. Yes, absolutely. Yes, sir. Commander-in-Chief has made them all captains. And they're, captain, 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 captain. Anyone in the military knows that's quite a feat. And to get it all at once on the same day as your best friends when you have just completed the most important mission of your life, what a time. So the astronauts, Pete Conrad, went on to endorse sunglasses. He was in an Amex commercial, if you remember Major League. He was in a commercial that they spoof in the movie where he says, you don't know me, but I walked on the moon. Because again, they're not famous like Neil and Buzz are. And he goes, but even I can't get into restaurants without my American Express card. So that was the original one. I still haven't been able to find footage of it, but I've read about it. He died in a motorcycle accident out west. And he died near a valley where the name, and I couldn't find it in the hour before the show, means Valley of the Moon or something to that effect. He went out having the time of his life, pushing the limits, being a pilot, having adventure. He's survived by his widow, Nancy, who is a friend of mine, a friend of ours, and a wonderful person, and still has the energy and verve that Pete used. Pete lived his life. Dick Gordon lived to be 88, I believe. They were all friends until they passed away one by one. Al Bean, if you've ever heard the phrase, they should have sent a poet, and let's expand that to they should have sent an artist. I told you that Al Bean took painting lessons. And Al had a wonderful career as a painter. He painted hundreds of breathtaking scenes from the moon, and he was wonderful at it. So see if you don't recognize what this is. Title of this painting is called The Fabulous Photo We Never Took. This was the plan for the camera timer. They were going to stand in front of Surveyor. They were going to link hands. They were going to raise the hammer triumphantly. And here's the camera with the timer. So Al painted real scenes from the moon. He painted imaginary scenes on the moon. He used his tools and put a bit of the moon on his paintings. This is a footprint of his boots. There's lunar dust in some of his paintings taken from like his spacesuit and the articles that he brought back. He used the hammer. I think this hammer stayed on the moon, but he used an identical hammer from the program to do some of the paint effects. He really made these a part of his experience. And I told you, and this is where we'll leave off, that he painted imaginary scenes on the moon too. And the one thing that was missing from the best trip any three friends have ever taken, this one's called The Fantasy. This is what they wish they could have done, picture or no. This is Al's painting of his two best friends with him on the Ocean of Storms. I'm sorry I went a little bit over 45.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that story. I really feel like we all got a backstage pass to the mission. It was really fun to hear all those details, and that painting at the end was.
Yeah, it's. I love his paintings. They're in collections and museums worldwide. We've got a couple of them. The National Air and Space Museum is one of the larger art museums in Washington, D.C. We just don't have as many walls as other art museums, so we don't hang much of it.
Yeah. Well, we do have some questions for you, so I want to make sure we get to those. One of our viewers says, for the Apollo 12 mission, were they able to correct the problem that caused the Apollo 11 moon landing to be off target from the intended landing site?
Yes. And I am not an engineer, so you'll have to forgive me, but I do know a little bit about how they did it. But I may get some of the terminology wrong or fuzzy. The key was Doppler, from what I recall, Doppler radar. Doppler is the sound when a car passes you on the highway, and there's a radar equivalent. And the realization was by one of the NASA engineers that they could use Doppler radar to watch the moon, and they could compare it against the radar inside the lunar module, which was also watching the moon. And if they knew where the moon was and they were watching it rotating and they knew where the LEM was, then they could do the math and figure out where the LEM was against the moon in a more accurate way than Apollo 11 had been able to do with its radar alone. So they could kind of, I hesitate to say parallax because I'm playing with scientific terms that have meanings. They were able to take the two data points and make it work. And one of the things that I recall with amusement, and I'm not a computer engineer, but this is also part of the story, is the way that they made that data digestible for the Apollo computer, which was, again, very sophisticated, but very small. And I hesitate to say primitive. It was like a shaker chair. But they told the computer that the moon had moved, the landing site had moved instead of the ship. So that was like the final quirk. They got an extra data point. They combined it with the data point they already had on 11. And then to make the computer understand it, they say, you know what? Don't think of it as the ship moving. Think of it as the landing point moving. Just that'll be fine. So from my understanding and recollection, that's how they hacked it together to make the pinpoint landing on 12.
One person says, amazing presentation. I would like a few more dates to help me with a timeline.
Oh, sure. November 1969. They launched in November of 1969. I could look, but I would just be Googling it. November, around Thanksgiving. This would have been 4 months after Apollo 11, and they were successful. So there was no delay for Apollo 13. But Apollo 13 was in April of 1970. So this was 4 months after 11 and 5 months before 13. So as we're closing out 1969, if Apollo 11 had not made it, and I don't mean that tragically, like, I don't know, spark plug went out and they had to come back without landing and everybody makes it back safe, 12 would have landed on the moon. And the first moon landing anniversary would be in November instead of July.
One of our viewers says that one of the engineers who created that Doppler device for the mission is in the audience.
Oh my God.
And his name is Bob. His name is Bob Hout, and he's in San Diego, California.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here with the time change. And thank you for landing Apollo 12 on the moon. Okay, now I'm suddenly nervous. I hope I got some of the details right and did justice to the work. And I apologize for not knowing who to name check, but apparently he's here with us tonight. So answer to the first person's question, please get with your classmate from the third question, because it turns out we have a much better answer.
That's great. That's so exciting.
That is very exciting.
Okay, here's another question for you. How are computers on today's rockets protected? Since we're assuming that they don't use that rope core memory that you were talking about.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting, okay, now I remember. I was about to say, that's interesting that you would say that, because one thing I didn't say about the rope core memory is that iron ferrite is inherently inured to cosmic rays and the kind of radiation that you encounter in space. But I do remember saying that it was protected because it was physical memory. I don't know. I don't know. But what I will tell you is that getting to the moon was not easy. The math in getting to the moon was not easy. There's one thing computers are good at, it's math. So new spacecraft notwithstanding, because I can't speak to it and I'm not sure how the shielding works. But one of the ways that they ensure reliability, and this is at least true of like the shuttle era, is they're not necessarily much more complicated than they need to be. The space shuttle computers famously were being maintained by the end of the program. Give you an idea of how long the space shuttle program went. The first mission launched 3 months after I was born. I took my wife to see the last space shuttle launch for our anniversary. So, right, long program. The components were so rare by the end of the program that engineers were buying them on eBay to maintain the shuttle fleet. And that's not shade. That is a testament to how reliable these computers were designed, that we stopped making them, but they kept working. So one of the answers to that, I think, is that the computers are designed to do exactly what they do, and they're not struggling under the weight of spam and spyware and add-ons and toolbars like my computer is today. I've got a lot of apps at the bottom of my screen. As some of you saw, thank you for your patience with my messy desktop. So that's the best I can answer about how computers today work in space.
I am very mindful of the time because we are at 8 o'clock, but if I could just ask one more question.
Sure, no, I'm yours. I can go a few minutes over. What can we do?
So a couple of summers ago, our summer theme was hidden figures, based on the book and the movie. And I was wondering if for the Apollo 12 mission, if it was those same female math computers who were determining the trajectory for this mission, or was it all, machine computers by then?
Yes and no. If you recall from the movie, by the time of John Glenn's flight, when he requests that in the movie Katherine Johnson recompute his flight to double check the computers were very new then. This was February of '62. So clearly we've got another 7 years by the time Apollo 11 lands and by the time Apollo 12 lands. Now, there were a lot of hidden figures at NASA. There were a lot of people at NASA that didn't calculate orbital trajectories. There were a lot of people that contributed to the mission. 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program. And there's a really good story where President Kennedy was visiting. Am I good? Can I keep? Do we need to cut off at 8?
Nope, we don't.
Okay, cool. So President Kennedy visited, I want to say it was Cape Canaveral, later Cape Kennedy, Kennedy Space Center. And the story goes, and this is probably apocryphal, but it demonstrates the spirit, that he met a custodian, and the custodian was pushing the cart, cleaning the floors, emptying the papers. President Kennedy said, what do you do? And he goes, I'm putting a man on the moon. Esprit de corps, 400,000 people working together for one perfect moment of human lunar contact. Back to the question. Katherine Johnson did calculate some of the trajectories for the Apollo program. I believe she worked on 11. Poppy Northrup, yes, that's right, was another woman that worked on the program, worked on, I think, the navigation. It had something to do with the trajectory. So yes, some of those same figures were maybe less hidden, certainly not as known to history at the time as they should have been. Now is the moment when we really want to recognize those contributions. But to the specific question of the specific women in Hidden Figures, I know that at least one of the main characters of the movie was still with the program through Apollo, and her daughter. I had a wonderful multi-hour conversation with Katherine Johnson's daughter once. Her daughter became a NASA mathematician. So like the passed through the generation, not just math talent, but like the responsibility of like calculating our paths through the stars.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's great. I think that's a great way to end the program. I want to thank you again. Do you want to make a plug for your podcast?
Oh, that's right. I have a podcast. I have a podcast. My executive producer is probably texting me right now. You said what? So I am one of 3 hosts of the podcast Airspace. You can find it wherever you find podcasts. It's distributed by PRX. And we aim to tell the very human stories that are kind of reminiscent of what we discussed here today. My co-hosts are Dr. Matt Schindel, a historian, and Dr. Emily Martin. She is a rock star, which is to say a geologist, planetary geologist. And we just have so much fun that you almost couldn't believe that we're doing it as work. Sometimes people say, wow, you have a fun job. I said, yeah, I know people that work for a living. I get to talk about spaceships with 2 of my closest friends. And we've got 2 wonderful producers, and the whole team are really proud of our show and would love for you to tune in. And if you had a good time tonight, and if you weren't put off by my freewheeling style and hit or miss wit.
I can attest, it's a great podcast.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And thank you all for tuning in tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.